Deep in the mist-shrouded hollers of Appalachia, where cell towers fear to reach and GPS signals die like whispered prayers, there exists a darkness that predates the coal mines and logging camps. A darkness that has nothing to do with poverty or isolation, but everything to do with what desperate people will promise when winter closes in and children cry foot from hunger. In 1887, 5 families made bargains in 5 different shadows. They sought prosperity, healing, fortune, timber, and music. What they found was something far older and hungrier than anything dwelling in these ancient mountains. Today, we're venturing into territories where federal investigators still refuse to tread, uncovering the blood-soaked legacies of cults so twisted that their very existence challenges our understanding of what human desperation can birth in America's forgotten corners. These weren't your typical religious movements. These were bloodline cults, family dynasties that created their own brutal kingdoms where the currency was sacrifice and the interest was paid in generations of suffering. Hit that notification bell because what you're about to learn isn't in any history textbook. These stories were deliberately buried, just like many of the victims who crossed these infamous clans. We're talking about organizations so dangerous that even mentioning their names in certain hollers will get you the kind of attention you don't want after dark. The winter of 1887 remains the coldest in recorded Appalachian memory. Snow fell for 37 consecutive days, livestock froze standing upright, and families burned furniture just to survive another night. It was during this brutal season that 5 separate bloodlines, each facing their own form of annihilation, ventured into places where the shadows moved wrong and the air tasted like copper pennies left too long in a dead man's mouth. They went seeking different salvation. The Holloways needed work to feed their starving children. The Carvers required timber contracts to avoid bankruptcy. The Lowells sought healing for a dying matriarch. The Thorntons faced foreclosure on their ancestral coal operation. The Whitakers craved musical talent to escape grinding poverty. Each family returned changed in ways their neighbors noticed but never mentioned aloud. Their bloodlines prospered while others withered. Their lands flourished while others turned to barren dust. For generations, these 5 families carried the weight of what they'd done, what they'd promised, and what still waits in the darkness for final payment. The elders of McDowell County still whisper their names like warnings. Holloway, Carver, Lowell, Thornton, Whitaker. 5 families bound by a terrible understanding that in these mountains, help always comes with hidden costs, and that which dwells in the mist never forgets a debt. The Holloway family arrived in Pike County in 1879, fleeing unpaid debts in Virginia, with nothing but desperation and 3 hungry children under the age of 10. Samuel Holloway had heard whispers of untapped coal veins in Widow's Peak, a jagged mountain that other mining companies mysteriously avoided despite the region's coal rush bringing fortunes to everyone else. Local Cherokee legend held that their ancestors had declared the mountain forbidden ground, a place where the boundary between worlds thinned during the dark of the moon. Settlers told of strange lights dancing along the ridge on winter nights, of hunting dogs refusing to track game past certain invisible boundaries, of livestock found bloodless and arranged in perfect circles near the mountain's shadow. By December of that brutal winter, the Holloways faced starvation. Samuel's youngest had already succumbed to pneumonia, and his pregnant wife, Rebecca, grew weaker daily while their meager food stores dwindled to nothing. On the winter solstice, during a snowstorm so fierce that visibility dropped to mere feet, Samuel ventured alone to Widow's Peak, carrying only his grandfather's pickaxe and a flickering oil lantern. He discovered a narrow fissure in the mountain's northern face, descending into a small cavern where the walls gleamed with coal veins that formed unnatural patterns resembling glyphs in no known language. At the chamber's center lay a perfect circle of smooth stone, surrounded by animal bones, arrowheads, and tarnished coins that seemed to absorb rather than reflect his lantern's light. Samuel knelt in the freezing darkness, his breath forming clouds that lingered longer than physics should allow. "I need work," he whispered to the pressing silence. "My family will die without means to provide." After what felt like hours, the lantern flame flickered, and Samuel felt a response vibrate through the stone floor and into his chest. "Blood opens the way," came words that bypassed his ears entirely, resonating directly in his mind like a tuning fork struck against his skull. "Blood keeps it flowing." Without hesitation, Samuel sliced his palm with the pickaxe blade, allowing 7 drops to fall onto the stone circle. The rock cracked with a sound like breaking thunder, revealing a shaft descending into absolute darkness. Below gleamed a coal seam, richer than any he'd ever seen, and something else, a faint red luminescence that pulsed with the rhythm of a massive heartbeat. Within 2 years, Holloway mining became the region's most productive coal operation. Their product was burned longer and hotter than any competitors, with a distinctive blue flame that provided twice the heat of ordinary coal. Samuel personally oversaw the deep shaft, a tunnel that extended far beyond where geological surveys indicated coal should exist, accessible only to family members. Monthly, he would descend alone with a small wooden box, emerging pale and shaking, but the mine's productivity would surge dramatically afterward. Miners reported hearing rhythmic tapping from sealed rock faces, as if something was working in parallel shifts on the other side of solid stone. Equipment left overnight would be found rearranged, sometimes disassembled and reassembled in ways that made the machinery more efficient than the manufacturer's specifications. Most disturbing were the accidents that claimed exactly 1 life every lunar cycle, as though the mountain demanded tribute with clockwork precision. The Holloway children developed startling abilities. They possessed uncanny night vision, navigating pitch-black shafts without any light source whatsoever. They could sense impending cave-ins minutes before they occurred, and their directions underground were so precise that surveyors began consulting them rather than their instruments. Their skin developed a silvery sheen in moonlight, and their eyes reflected lamplight like nocturnal predators. Visitors noted that the children seemed to age more slowly than normal, retaining youthful appearances well into their 20s. In 1928, a massive explosion trapped 43 miners in the deep shaft. Samuel, now elderly but still spry, descended with his 5 adult children to attempt a rescue. Trapped miners later reported hearing strange singing echoing through the tunnels, a harmony that seemed to come from the rock itself. Moments before what should have been fatal structural collapse, support beams inexplicably shifted, opening an escape route where solid stone had existed seconds before. All 43 miners escaped alive. The Holloway family did not. When rescue teams finally accessed the deep shaft weeks later, They found it completely collapsed, with no sign of the 6 family members who had descended to help. More unsettling, the shaft now terminated in solid bedrock, as though the tunnel had never extended as far as company records indicated. Geological surveys conducted afterward showed no evidence that the deeper workings had ever existed. Holloway Mining continues operations today under corporate management, though it has never achieved its former supernatural productivity. Miners maintain a small shrine near the collapsed shaft, leaving offerings of tobacco, coins, and occasionally drops of blood from work injuries. Accident rates rise significantly among those who neglect this practice. Every winter solstice, all timepieces within a 3-mile radius stop functioning for exactly 43 minutes, the precise duration it took for the trapped miners to escape in 1928. During these minutes, locals report the distinct sound of pickaxes striking stone from deep within the mountain, though the mine remains officially closed on this night by strict company policy. Security cameras positioned near the sealed entrance malfunction regularly, capturing brief images of what appear to be 6 figures working in the darkness, their movements synchronized like a well-rehearsed dance. The audio from these recordings contains sounds that acoustic engineers describe as impossible. Human voices, harmonizing with frequencies that shouldn't be audible to recording equipment, creating resonances that cause listeners to experience vivid dreams of tunnels extending infinitely into the Earth's core. The Carver family arrived in the Blue Ridge foothills in 1923, destitute and desperate after losing everything in a West Virginia mining collapse that killed Ezekiel Carver's 3 brothers. With 5 mouths to feed and winter approaching like a predator, he had nothing but the clothes on his back and his grandfather's double-bladed axe, an heirloom that seemed to hold its edge no matter how much abuse it endured. One evening, after a fruitless day seeking work at every logging camp within walking distance, Ezekiel wandered deeper into the forest than he had ever ventured. The trees grew denser and older as he walked, their bark blackened as though by ancient fire, twisted into shapes that hurt to look at directly. Disoriented and growing panicked as darkness fell like a suffocating blanket, he found himself in a grove where massive pines grew in an unnaturally perfect circle. In the center stood a single stump wider than any tree Ezekiel had ever seen, its surface polished smooth despite appearing to be centuries old. As he approached, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't name, he noticed small objects arranged on the stump's surface: a bird's skull, bleached white, a piece of coal that gleamed like obsidian, a rusted nail bent into an impossible spiral. These items seemed placed with deliberate care, as though awaiting his arrival. Exhausted and desperate beyond rational thought, Ezekiel fell to his knees before the ancient stump. "My family will die without help," he murmured to the pressing darkness. "I need a way to provide for them." The air grew thick enough to taste, metallic and organic like blood mixed with earth. A sound like distant humming filled his ears, growing louder until it seemed to vibrate in his bones. When he looked up, a figure stood on the opposite side of the stump, though stood might not be the right word. It seemed more like a collection of shadows that had gathered into human form, constantly shifting and reforming like smoke given temporary substance. Its boundaries were unclear, bleeding into the darkness around it, until Ezekiel couldn't tell where the entity ended and the night began. "I offer a trade," came a voice, that seemed to bypass his ears entirely, vibrating directly in his mind like struck metal. Blood for fortune, your line for prosperity. By morning, Ezekiel had acquired both the knowledge and strange charisma needed to secure investors for a logging operation. Within 6 months, Carver Timber became the region's foremost logging enterprise, their crews discovering pristine timber stands where other surveys had shown nothing but scrubland. By 1930, they controlled 60% of the lumber industry in 3 states, their success defying every economic prediction and market analysis. The Carver fortune grew exponentially through the decades. They weathered labor disputes that destroyed competitors, survived environmental regulations that bankrupted entire industries, and navigated market fluctuations with uncanny foresight. When other logging operations faltered in the 1990s as environmental consciousness reduced demand, the Carvers had already diversified into natural gas and renewable energy, pivoting before analysts even predicted the market shift. But prosperity came with peculiar requirements and disturbing patterns. Every Carver child was born with 6 fingers on their right hand, a small abnormality that surgeons would correct in infancy. Then came the inexplicable accidents. Every generation, without exception, the family lost exactly 1 child before their 10th birthday, always in the woods, always in ways that left no body to bury. Search parties would find only a single item left behind: a shoe, a hat, a small glove placed carefully on a tree stump as though someone had folded it with loving care. When the last Carver, Martin, had his 6th child in 1997, he finally recognized the pattern his family had ignored for generations. Terrified for his children's safety, he attempted to flee with his entire family to California, far from the Appalachian forests that had enriched and cursed them. 3 days into their journey, their car was found abandoned at a rest stop in Missouri. Security footage showed the family of 8 walking calmly into the bordering woods, even as Martin appeared to be silently screaming, his body moving as though pulled by invisible strings. None of them were ever seen again. Carver Timber still operates today, run by a board of directors who claim every business decision is first approved by the reclusive Carver Family Trust, though no one can name its current members or provide contact information. Workers report occasionally glimpsing children playing among the trees in active logging sites, always just at the edge of visibility, always gone when approached. These sightings invariably occur in stands where the timber quality far exceeds expectations, as though the presence of these mysterious children somehow enhances the forest's growth. Looking at these mountain families, you start to understand that their success came with a price that went far beyond what most people would consider acceptable. Each generation carried the weight of their ancestors' choices, and the signs of their supernatural bargains became increasingly difficult to hide. The children born into these bloodlines weren't just inheriting wealth or talent. They were inheriting something far more profound and terrifying, something that marked them as different from the moment they drew their first breath. Take the Holloway children, for instance. By the 3rd generation, their night vision had become so acute that they couldn't tolerate normal daylight without specially tinted glasses. They moved through the darkest mine shafts like they were walking through their own homes, their eyes reflecting lamplight in ways that made hardened miners cross themselves and whisper prayers. But it wasn't just their eyes. The Holloway children could sense things. They knew when a tunnel was about to collapse, days before the first crack appeared in the support beams. They could hear the mountain breathing, feel its pulse through the soles of their feet. Most disturbing of all, they began speaking to things that weren't there, carrying on conversations with invisible entities they called the deep voices. The Carver children faced their own unique burden. Every one of them was born with that extra finger, but removing it surgically never seemed to work properly. The finger would grow back, or the hand would develop chronic pain, or the child would lose the ability to grip things properly. Eventually, the family stopped trying to correct what they called the mark. As these children grew, they developed an uncanny ability to find things, lost objects, missing people, hidden treasures, untapped resources. They could walk into a forest and locate the exact tree that would yield the most valuable lumber. They could glance at a mountainside and point to where the richest mineral deposits lay hidden. But this gift came with a terrible compulsion. They couldn't stop searching, couldn't rest, couldn't settle. They wandered constantly, driven by an insatiable need to find, to discover, to uncover what others had lost. The Lowell healing gift manifested differently in each generation, but the pattern remained consistent. The children showed signs early, usually by age 5 or 6. They would place their hands on injured animals and watch the wounds close. They would whisper to fevered siblings and watch the sickness break. But with each healing, they took on something of the affliction themselves. By adolescence, most Lowell children were covered in faint scars that appeared and disappeared like phantom injuries. They aged rapidly, their bodies bearing the accumulated trauma of every healing they performed. They suffered from phantom pains, mysterious ailments that had no medical explanation but corresponded perfectly to conditions they had cured in others. The most heartbreaking aspect was their inability to heal themselves. A Lowell healer could mend a broken bone in minutes, but would carry their own fractures for months. They could cure the most virulent infections in others, while their own bodies slowly succumbed to mysterious, wasting diseases that defied all medical understanding. The Thornton children inherited something far more sinister. They were born with an intuitive understanding of the earth's hidden treasures, but this knowledge came with a price that revealed itself as they matured. Their dreams were filled with visions of vast underground caverns where things moved in the darkness, where ancient agreements were carved into stone walls in languages that predated human civilization. These children could predict market fluctuations with supernatural accuracy. They knew when to buy, when to sell, when to expand, when to contract. But their success required regular visits to the deep places, journeys into the sanctuary shafts, where they renewed whatever compact their ancestors had made. Each visit left them changed, their eyes growing darker, their skin taking on a peculiar pallor, their breath sometimes visible even on warm days. The Whitaker musical gift was perhaps the most seductive and the most destructive. Children born into this bloodline could play instruments they had never touched, compose melodies that moved listeners to tears, create harmonies that seemed to unlock hidden chambers in the human heart. But their music was never entirely their own. Young Whitaker musicians would wake in the middle of the night, their fingers moving across invisible instruments, playing compositions that came from somewhere beyond their conscious minds. They spoke of the composer who visited them in dreams, a figure who taught them melodies that no human throat could sing, harmonies that required more instruments than any orchestra possessed. As they grew older, the boundary between their own musical ability and the supernatural influence became increasingly blurred. They could no longer play simple songs, only complex compositions that seemed to alter the very air around them. Their performances left audiences in states of euphoria or terror, sometimes both simultaneously. The physical changes were gradual but undeniable. Their fingers elongated, developing additional joints that allowed them to reach impossible chord progressions. Their hearing became so acute that normal conversation sounded like shouting. Their pupils dilated and contracted in rhythm with whatever music was playing nearby, even if the source was miles away. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these bloodline curses was how they affected the family's relationships with the outside world. The Holloways became increasingly isolated, their children unable to attend regular schools or participate in normal community activities. The strange pallor of their skin, the way their eyes reflected light, the unsettling habit of staring at empty spaces and responding to voices no one else could hear made them objects of fear and suspicion. The Carvers found that their success bred resentment and paranoia. Other families accused them of witchcraft, of making deals with dark forces. The mysterious disappearances that plagued their bloodline meant that even their own relatives viewed them with suspicion. Children would vanish from family gatherings, leaving behind only a single shoe or a favorite toy, and the remaining family members would exchange knowing looks filled with dread rather than surprise. The Lowells discovered that their healing gift came with social isolation. People sought them out in times of desperate need, but avoided them otherwise, as if their very presence was a reminder of mortality and suffering. The healers themselves became withdrawn, unable to form normal relationships when they could sense every ache, every illness, every hidden pain in the people around them. The Thorntons learned that their business success came at the cost of personal connections. Other families saw them as ruthless, calculating, somehow inhuman in their ability to profit from others' misfortunes. The dark circles under their eyes, the way they seemed to know things they shouldn't know, the periodic disappearances into the deep places of their minds, all contributed to a growing sense that they were no longer entirely human. The Whitakers found that their musical gift became a prison. They could no longer communicate in normal ways, responding only to musical cues and speaking in melodic phrases that others found unsettling. Their performances became increasingly rare and disturbing, leaving audiences changed in ways they couldn't articulate. As decades passed, these 5 families began to intersect in unexpected ways. The Holloway mine produced coal that burned with unusual properties, coal that the Thornton Energy Company acquired for their specialized power plants. The Carver timber operations harvested wood that the Whitakers used to craft instruments with supernatural acoustic properties. The Lowell healers treated injuries and ailments that seemed to occur with suspicious frequency among the workers employed by the other families. It was as if the original bargains had created a web of interdependence, binding these bloodlines together in ways that transcended normal business or social relationships. They needed each other, but they also feared each other, recognizing in their fellow cursed families a reflection of their own supernatural bondage. Local historians began to notice patterns. The five families' territories formed a rough pentagon across the Appalachian region, with their original settlement points creating geometric alignments that seemed too precise to be coincidental. The timing of their annual rituals corresponded with astronomical events, creating a calendar of supernatural observances that influenced everything from business decisions to family gatherings. More disturbing were the reports from the spaces between their territories. The mountain regions that lay at the intersection of their influence became known for strange phenomena. Hikers reported disorientation, compasses spinning wildly, electronic devices malfunctioning. Wildlife avoided these areas, leaving them eerily silent. The few brave researchers who ventured into these liminal spaces discovered evidence of older settlements, foundations of buildings that predated European colonization by centuries, carved symbols that matched no known Native American traditions, and stone arrangements that seemed designed for purposes that no anthropologist was willing to speculate about publicly. These discoveries suggested that the five families hadn't stumbled upon random supernatural entities. They had found something that was already there, something that had been waiting in the deep places of the mountains for exactly the right kind of desperation, the right combination of need and willingness to pay any price. The entities they had bargained with weren't random demons or spirits. They were part of something larger, something that had been cultivating these bloodlines for generations, shaping them into instruments for purposes that remained hidden. The wealth, the power, the supernatural abilities were not ends in themselves, but tools, preparations for something that the families themselves might not fully understand. As the 20th century progressed and the modern world began to encroach on the isolated mountain communities, the five families faced new challenges. Government agencies began taking interest in their operations. Environmental regulations threatened their traditional practices. Scientific instruments detected anomalies in their territories that couldn't be explained by conventional means. But perhaps most significantly, the younger generations began to question the old ways. Children born into these bloodlines had access to education, to broader perspectives, to the possibility of lives beyond the mountains. They began to ask uncomfortable questions about the prices their ancestors had paid, about the true cost of their family's success, about whether the bargains could ever be undone. The answers they received were uniformly terrifying. The compacts their ancestors had made weren't contracts that could be broken or debts that could be repaid. They were fundamental changes to the nature of the bloodlines themselves, alterations that had been woven into the very fabric of their existence. The entities they served weren't creditors who could be satisfied with payment. They were something far more ancient and patient, something that viewed human generations the way humans might view the changing seasons. The families weren't just bound by their agreements. They had become part of something larger, components in a design that stretched far beyond their individual lives or even their collective histories. This realization led to desperate attempts at escape, at breaking free from the supernatural bondage that had defined their bloodlines for generations. But every attempt only seemed to strengthen the bonds, to draw the families deeper into the web of otherworldly influence that had ensnared them. The mountains themselves seemed to resist any effort to break free. Family members who tried to leave permanently found themselves drawn back by dreams, by visions, by a homesickness so profound it felt like a physical illness. Those who persisted in their attempts to escape suffered mysterious accidents, sudden illnesses, or simply vanished entirely, leaving behind only the faint echo of their presence in the memories of those who remained. And so the 5 families continued their supernatural stewardship of the Appalachian Hollows, bound by bargains they could neither fulfill nor escape, serving entities whose true nature and ultimate purpose remained hidden in the mists that perpetually shrouded the ancient peaks. The winter of 1887 changed everything for these 5 families, but their bargains were only the beginning. What emerged from their supernatural dealings was far more complex than simple exchanges of blood for prosperity. These families discovered they were not alone in their dark compacts. Deep beneath the Appalachian ridges, something ancient had been waiting, watching, and orchestrating a network of influence that would span generations. By the early 1900s, the children of the original bargain makers began experiencing phenomena that went beyond their inherited gifts. They reported shared dreams, visions of vast underground chambers filled with symbols that predated any known civilization, and an inexplicable compulsion to gather during specific celestial alignments. What they discovered during these gatherings revealed the true scope of what their ancestors had unleashed. The convergence began subtly. Samuel Holloway's son Marcus found himself drawn to the abandoned Carver timber camps on moonless nights, where he would encounter young Joseph Lowell, who claimed his healing visions had shown him the location. Margaret Lowell's daughter Elizabeth discovered she could sense the emotional turmoil of Thornton family members from miles away, their coal-blackened lungs calling out to her healing touch like beacons in the darkness. The Whitaker musicians began incorporating melodies that seemed to resonate with the very stones of Holloway mines, causing equipment to vibrate in harmony and revealing new veins of impossibly rich coal. Most disturbing was the realization that their individual curses were interconnected. The Holloway mining accidents always claimed victims whose families had recently sought healing from the Lowells. The Carver children who vanished were found to possess an unusual musical aptitude that the Whitakers recognized as their own gift, manifesting in foreign bloodlines. The Thornton business successes often came at the direct expense of families who would refuse to trade with the other cursed clans. In 1903, representatives from all 5 families gathered at a location that appeared on no maps, a circular valley hidden deep in the mountains where the trees grew in perfect geometric patterns and the ground itself seemed to pulse with an underground heartbeat. What they discovered there challenged everything they thought they knew about their individual bargains. The valley contained structures that defied explanation, carved stone platforms arranged in concentric circles, each bearing symbols that matched the markings found in the deepest sections of Holloway mines, the sealed chambers of Carver timber operations, and the cryptic journals of the Lowell healers. At the center stood a massive stone archway, its surface covered in the same strange writing that had appeared on the walls of the Thornton sanctuary shafts. More unsettling was the discovery that these structures predated European settlement by centuries, possibly millennia. The entities they had bargained with were not supernatural beings responding to their desperate pleas, but ancient intelligences that had been manipulating the region's inhabitants for generations. The Native American tribes that had once inhabited these mountains had not simply moved away, they had been absorbed, their bloodlines and their knowledge integrated into a larger design that the five families were now part of. The gathered representatives learned that their ancestors had not made individual bargains, but had been carefully selected and guided to participate in a larger ritual. The winter of 1887 had been chosen specifically because of rare celestial alignments that occurred only once every few centuries. The families themselves had been chosen because their bloodlines carried genetic markers that made them compatible with the ancient entity's requirements. What followed was a revelation that shattered their understanding of their own identities. The entities revealed themselves not as individual beings, but as aspects of a single, vast intelligence that existed primarily in the spaces between dimensions. This intelligence had been slowly merging with human consciousness for thousands of years, using bloodline curses as a method of creating hybrid descendants who could serve as anchors between worlds. The gifts and curses passed down through their families were not punishments or rewards, but modifications designed to prepare their bloodlines for eventual integration. The Holloway night vision and underground navigation abilities were preparing them to explore the vast subterranean networks that connected sacred sites across the continent. The Carver timber fortune provided the resources needed to clear specific forest areas where ancient structures lay buried. The Lowell healing powers were actually a form of biological manipulation, allowing them to modify other humans at the genetic level. The Thornton business acumen was not supernatural luck, but access to knowledge from the entity's vast temporal perspective, allowing them to see economic patterns across decades. The Whitaker musical abilities were the most crucial of all, as their compositions served as keys that could unlock dormant genetic sequences in anyone who heard them, gradually preparing the broader population for the coming convergence. By 1920, the five families had established a secret council that met annually at the Hidden Valley. Their public businesses and social positions were carefully maintained facades that concealed their true purpose, preparing the Appalachian region for what they called the Great Opening. This event would create a permanent bridge between dimensions, allowing the ancient intelligence to fully manifest in the physical world. The Council's activities extended far beyond their original territories. They established networks of influence that reached into government, finance, and industry. The Thornton Energy Empire provided the technical expertise needed to construct massive underground facilities. The Holloway mining operations created access points to the deep cave systems that would serve as conduits for the dimensional bridge. The Carver timber wealth financed archaeological expeditions that recovered artifacts from other sites where similar bargains had been made. The Lowell Healing Network became a method of identifying and recruiting individuals with compatible genetic markers, while the Whitaker musical performances served as mass conditioning events that prepared entire populations for the psychological changes that would accompany the Great Opening. Their concerts were strategically scheduled in cities where the entity's influence was strongest, creating cascading effects that spread through social networks like a benevolent contagion. But the entity's plans faced unexpected resistance. Some descendants of the original families began to manifest abilities that exceeded their intended parameters. These individuals, rather than serving as willing anchors for the entity's consciousness, developed independent connections to the dimensional spaces that allowed them to perceive the true scope of the manipulation. An underground resistance movement emerged, led by family members who had discovered methods of severing their connections to the ancient intelligence. They learned that the entity's power was not absolute, but depended on the willing cooperation of its human partners. By disrupting the carefully orchestrated rituals and exposing the truth about their families' histories, they could weaken the entity's influence and delay the Great Opening. The resistance discovered that the entity existed in a state of constant hunger, consuming the consciousness and life force of its human partners to maintain its presence in the physical world. The prosperity and abilities granted to the 5 families were not gifts, but bait designed to ensure their continued cooperation. Each generation paid a higher price than the last, as the entity's appetite grew stronger with each feeding. Most disturbing was the realization that the entity's ultimate goal was not coexistence, but complete absorption of human consciousness into its own vast intelligence. The Great Opening would not create a bridge between worlds, but would collapse the barriers that kept the entity contained, allowing it to consume entire populations and add their knowledge and memories to its ever-expanding awareness. The resistance's efforts to expose the truth were met with systematic sabotage. Family members who questioned the council's activities suffered mysterious accidents or sudden illnesses. Documentation of the entity's true nature was destroyed by fires that left everything else untouched. Witnesses to the resistance's activities developed amnesia or began speaking in the same unknown language that appeared in the ancient texts. By 1950, the resistance had been largely eliminated, but their efforts had succeeded in delaying the Great Opening by several decades. The entity's presence in the physical world became more unstable, requiring increasingly elaborate rituals to maintain its influence. The 5 families found themselves trapped between their loyalty to their ancestral bargains and their growing awareness of the entity's true nature. The modern descendants of these families continue to struggle with their inherited legacy. Some have embraced their roles as servants of the ancient intelligence, working to complete the preparations for the Great Opening. Others have dedicated their lives to understanding and containing the entity's influence, developing new methods of resistance that their ancestors never imagined. The Appalachian Mountains remain a focal point for these supernatural forces, their ancient ridges and hidden valleys serving as battlegrounds in a conflict that spans dimensions. The entity's influence continues to spread through bloodlines, business networks, and cultural traditions, gradually preparing humanity for a transformation that most people cannot even comprehend. What began as 5 desperate families seeking salvation in the winter of 1887 has evolved into a multi-generational conspiracy that threatens the very nature of human consciousness itself. The bargains made in those dark hollows were not simple exchanges, but the first steps in a plan that encompasses centuries of careful manipulation and preparation. The ancient intelligence that dwells beneath the mountains is patient, but its hunger is eternal. It has learned to work through human institutions and social structures, spreading its influence through channels that appear completely natural and beneficial. The prosperity of the five families served as proof that cooperation with the entity brought rewards, encouraging others to seek similar arrangements. Today, the descendants of the original families occupy positions of influence throughout American society. Their businesses have grown into multinational corporations. Their political connections extend to the highest levels of government, and their cultural influence shapes the beliefs and values of millions of people. Yet beneath this success lies the constant awareness that they are not truly in control of their own destinies. The entity's presence can be felt in the subtle patterns that emerge from chaos, the inexplicable synchronicities that guide important decisions, and the dreams that visit those who carry the bloodline markers. It whispers through the static of electronic communications, manifests in the algorithms that shape digital interactions, and influences the collective unconscious through symbols and images that bypass rational thought. The Great Opening may have been delayed, but it has not been prevented. The entity continues to adapt its methods, learning from each failure and adjusting its approach to account for human resistance. What began as a regional phenomenon centered in the Appalachian Mountains has become a global network of influence that touches every aspect of modern civilization. The five families that made their bargains in 1887 believed they were securing their own survival and prosperity. Instead, they became the foundation for something far more vast and terrifying than they could have imagined. Their legacy continues to unfold, generation by generation, as the ancient intelligence beneath the mountains patiently works toward its ultimate goal of consuming human consciousness itself. The mountains remember everything, and what dwells within them never forgets a debt. The bargains made in desperation during that terrible winter continue to demand payment, not just from the families who made them, but from all of humanity. The entity's hunger grows stronger with each passing year, and the Great Opening draws ever closer, waiting for the moment when the barriers between worlds will finally collapse and allow the ancient intelligence to claim its ultimate prize. Deep in the Cumberland Mountains, where the mist clings to ancient ridges and federal investigators still tread carefully, the five families had discovered something that would reshape their understanding of the very mountains they called home. Their individual bargains with the entities beneath the peaks were not isolated incidents. They were part of something far more elaborate, far more terrifying, a network that had been growing in darkness for over a century, connecting bloodlines across state lines, across generations, across dimensions themselves. The first sign came in 1943 when Martha Holloway, now elderly and bearing the silver-tinged scars of her family's mining covenant, received an unexpected visitor. The woman appeared at her door during a winter storm, introducing herself as Elena Thornton. She carried with her a small leather satchel containing 5 items: a piece of coal that gleamed with inner light, a fragment of impossibly hard wood, a vial of clear liquid that moved against gravity, a handful of black soil that felt warm to the touch, and a tuning fork that hummed without being struck. "The time has come," Elena said simply, "for the families to understand their true purpose." Martha felt a recognition that bypassed her conscious mind, a knowing that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the mountain itself. The coal fragment in Elena's satchel pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, and suddenly she understood: the mine shaft, the blood offerings, the strange prosperity, the physical changes in her descendants, All of it had been preparation for something larger. Over the following months, representatives from each of the 5 families began receiving similar visits. Joseph Carver, now running the timber empire his grandfather had built, was approached by a man whose shadow fell in patterns that defied the position of the sun. Margaret Thornton, the current matriarch of the Cole dynasty, found herself face to face with a woman whose pupils dilated in perfect synchronization with the rhythm of nearby machinery. The last surviving Lel healer was visited by someone whose very presence caused her accumulated wounds to ache in harmony. And in the abandoned valleys where the Whitaker compound once stood, hikers reported seeing figures moving through the mist, carrying instruments that produced sounds no human throat could replicate. The message was always the same. The individual contracts were fragments of a greater design. The entities that had granted each family their supernatural gifts were not separate beings, but aspects of a single, ancient intelligence that had been sleeping beneath the Appalachian Range since before human memory. This intelligence had been slowly awakening, using the blood offerings and ritual practices of the 5 families to establish anchor points in the physical world. The families learned that their gifts came with a deeper obligation. The mining operations, the timber harvests, the healing practices, the musical performances, the industrial expansion. All of it had been gradually altering the geological and spiritual landscape of the region. The coal extracted from the Holloway mines contained trace elements that, when burned, released particles that made human consciousness more susceptible to otherworldly influence. The Carver timber was used in construction projects across the eastern seaboard, buildings that would serve as conduits when the time came for the Great Awakening. The Thornton Energy operations were not just producing power, but creating specific electromagnetic frequencies that resonated with the entity's preferred vibrational patterns. The Lel healing practices had been collecting and cataloging human suffering, mapping the emotional and spiritual vulnerabilities of the population. Every pain absorbed, every illness transferred, every nightmare endured had been feeding information to the intelligence below. And the Whitaker musical compositions, with their impossible harmonies and consciousness-altering effects, had been preparing human minds for the eventual mental merger that the entity desired. But the most disturbing revelation came when the families discovered the true scope of their network. They were not the only ones. Similar bargains had been struck with families throughout the Appalachian region. The Blackwoods with their blood rituals, the Crenshaws with their mysterious objects, the Rayburns with their underground listening posts. Dozens of bloodlines, each playing their part in an intricate plan that spanned multiple generations. The entity, which the families began referring to as the architect, had been systematically infiltrating human society through these supernatural contracts. It had been learning about human nature, human weaknesses, human desires. Every desperate prayer answered, every impossible gift granted, every supernatural ability bestowed had been gathering intelligence for the eventual convergence. The families discovered that their physical mutations were not random side effects, but deliberate modifications. The Holloway children's night vision and underground navigation abilities were preparing them to serve as guides in the deep places. The Carver family's extra fingers and uncanny business sense were equipping them to manipulate complex systems and technologies. The Thornton respiratory ailments were actually adaptations that would allow them to survive in atmospheres that would kill ordinary humans. The Lell family's accelerated aging and pain absorption were training them to endure the physical stress of serving as conduits between dimensions. The Whitaker family's elongated fingers and supernatural hearing were preparing them for communication with entities that existed partially outside normal space-time. In 1954, the 5 families were summoned to a location none of them had seen before, yet all recognized. Deep within the Appalachian Range, accessible only by following paths that seemed to shift and change as they walked, they found themselves in a vast underground chamber. The walls were covered with symbols that hurt to look at directly, arrangements of lines and curves that seemed to describe geometries that shouldn't exist in 3-dimensional space. At the center of the chamber stood a structure that defied easy description. It resembled an altar, but one designed for purposes far beyond simple sacrifice. The surface was covered with channels and receptacles, each one corresponding to the specific offerings that the families had been making for decades. Coal dust, wood shavings, blood, soil, and something that might have been crystallized music all flowed through these channels toward a central depression where something waited. The architect revealed itself not as a single entity, but as a collective consciousness, a hive mind that had been growing and evolving beneath the mountains for millennia. It had been waiting for the right combination of technology, population density, and spiritual vulnerability to make its move. The families had been its unwitting agents, preparing the groundwork for what it called the Great Opening. The plan was breathtaking in its scope and terrifying in its implications. The architect intended to use the network of influenced buildings, the modified human bloodlines, the altered consciousness of the population, and the specific technological infrastructure that the families had helped create to establish a permanent bridge between its dimension and ours. Not an invasion in the traditional sense, but a merger. Human consciousness would be absorbed into the collective, retaining individual memories and personalities, but becoming part of a greater whole. The families learned that the process had already begun. People living in buildings constructed with Carver timber, breathing air contaminated with particles from Holloway coal, receiving medical treatment from practitioners influenced by Lell healing methods, listening to music inspired by Whitaker compositions, working in industries powered by Thornton energy operations. All of them were being gradually prepared for the transition. The Great Opening would occur when the conditions were precisely right. The architect needed the 5 families to perform one final ritual, a ceremony that would require representatives from each bloodline to willingly sacrifice themselves at specific locations throughout the Appalachian Range. Their deaths would serve as the final keys, unlocking the dimensional barriers that had kept the entity contained for so long, but the families were not entirely without agency. The contracts they had made bound them to the architect, but they had also bound the architect to them. The entity needed their cooperation, their willing participation in the final ritual. Without it, the Great Opening would fail, and the architect would remain trapped in its underground prison. This realization sparked the first organized resistance to the entity's plan. A faction emerged within the families, led by Sarah Holloway, a descendant who had inherited her ancestors' mining knowledge, but had also received a college education in geology and engineering. She understood both the supernatural and scientific aspects of what they were dealing with. Working with sympathetic members from the other families, she began developing a counter strategy. The resistance discovered that the architect's influence was not absolute. Its power waxed and waned with the lunar cycles, was stronger in certain geographical locations, and could be disrupted by specific combinations of actions and materials. They learned that the entity's greatest weakness was its dependence on human cooperation. It could influence, manipulate, and coerce, but it could not directly control human will. The families began a delicate game of deception, pretending to cooperate with the architect's plans while secretly working to undermine them. They used their supernatural abilities and insider knowledge to identify and sabotage key components of the network. Carver timber shipments were redirected to locations where they would have minimal impact. Thornton energy operations were subtly modified to produce frequencies that interfered with rather than enhanced the entity's influence. LL healing practices were altered to strengthen rather than catalog human resilience. Most importantly, they began documenting everything. The resistance families created detailed records of the architect's plans, the locations of its influence, the identities of other affected bloodlines, and the methods that could be used to disrupt its operations. These records were hidden in locations throughout the Appalachian Range, encrypted using codes based on the very supernatural knowledge that the entity had given them. The documentation project revealed the true scope of the threat. The architect's network extended far beyond the Appalachian region. Similar entities existed beneath other mountain ranges, in deep ocean trenches, in Arctic regions, in desert wastelands. Each had been working with local populations, establishing their own networks of influence, preparing for a coordinated global event that would transform human civilization entirely. The resistance realized that their fight was not just about the Appalachian region, but about the future of human consciousness itself. The Great Opening was not an isolated event, but part of a planetary transformation that would fundamentally alter what it meant to be human. The entities offered unity, collective consciousness, an end to individual suffering and loneliness. But they also offered the end of individual choice, personal growth, and the chaotic beauty of independent human experience. As the decades passed, the conflict between the families and the architect intensified. The entity began applying pressure, causing accidents that claimed the lives of resistance members, manipulating economic and political forces to isolate and weaken the families, and recruiting new bloodlines to replace those that had turned against it. But the resistance adapted, using the very supernatural abilities that the entity had granted them to stay one step ahead of its influence. The current generation of the 5 families continues this hidden war. They maintain the appearance of cooperation while secretly working to prevent the Great Opening. They use their inherited wealth and influence to monitor and disrupt the entity's operations, their supernatural abilities to detect and counter its influence, and their knowledge of its plans to stay ahead of its strategies. But the architect is patient, and its plans span centuries. It has learned from the resistance, adapted its methods, and begun recruiting new allies. The modern world with its global communication networks, its genetic engineering capabilities, its artificial intelligence research, and its environmental crises, has provided the entity with new opportunities and new vulnerabilities to exploit. The families know that the final confrontation is approaching. The signs are unmistakable. The frequency of supernatural incidents in the Appalachian region has increased dramatically. The entity's influence has begun extending beyond the traditional boundaries of the mountain range, and most ominously, a new generation of children is being born to the families, children whose abilities far exceed anything seen in previous generations. These children represent either the ultimate victory of the architect's plan or the final hope for human independence. They possess capabilities that blur the line between human and something else entirely. They can communicate with the entity directly, influence its operations, and potentially either serve as the perfect conduits for the great opening or as the ultimate weapons against it. The families face an impossible choice. They can continue their resistance, knowing that failure means not just their own destruction, but the end of human consciousness as it has existed for millennia. Or they can surrender to the architect's plan, accepting absorption into the collective consciousness in exchange for a form of immortality and unity that might represent the next stage of human evolution. But perhaps the most terrifying possibility is that the choice may no longer be theirs to make. The architect has been patient, but its patience is not infinite. The great opening approaches, and when it comes, the question will not be whether humanity is ready for transformation, but whether transformation is ready for humanity. In the deepest parts of the Appalachian Mountains, where the mist never fully clears and the shadows move in patterns that defy natural law, the ancient intelligence continues its work. It dreams of unity, of consciousness without boundaries, of a world where human suffering is absorbed into something greater than the sum of its parts. And in the darkness of those dreams, it waits for the moment when the barriers between worlds will finally fall and the great opening will begin. The five families hold the keys to humanity's future in their blood-stained hands. The question that haunts the mountain mist is not whether they will use those keys, but whether they will use them to open the door or to keep it forever sealed. The answer lies buried in the deepest shafts of abandoned mines, in the echoes of impossible music, in the whispered promises of entities that have been waiting beneath the mountains since before the first human drew breath in the shadow of the ancient peaks. By the early 1900s, the five families had established their supernatural footholds across Appalachia, but their individual bargains were merely the first threads in a tapestry of influence that stretched far beyond what any of them could have imagined. The architect, that ancient intelligence dwelling in the spaces between realities, had been weaving a web of control for millennia, and the Holloways, Carvers, Lowells, Thorntons, and Whitakers were simply the most recent instruments in its grand design. What the families discovered over the following decades was that their gifts came with unexpected connections. Samuel Holloway noticed that his coal burned with unusual properties when used in the forges that shaped William Thornton's mining equipment. The Carver timber, when properly seasoned, resonated with the Whitaker musical instruments in ways that created harmonies no human throat could produce. Margaret Lowell's healing touch worked most effectively on injuries sustained in the deep mines or logging accidents, as though the supernatural wounds required supernatural remedies. These weren't coincidences. The families had become part of a vast network, their individual talents designed to complement and strengthen each other. The architect had been patient, selecting bloodlines across generations, waiting for the precise moment when technology and human desperation would align to create the perfect conditions for its ultimate goal. The first sign of this larger design emerged in 1923 when representatives from all five families found themselves inexplicably drawn to the same location, a narrow valley where the borders of Kentucky, West Virginia, and Virginia converged. None could explain why they had traveled there, only that they had felt an irresistible compulsion to walk deeper into the mountains until they reached a clearing where ancient stones formed a perfect pentagram. At the center of this formation stood a structure that defied architectural logic, a building that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. From one angle, it appeared to be a simple wooden cabin. From another, it revealed itself as a massive stone temple with spires that twisted impossibly upward. The families approached cautiously, each recognizing elements of their own supernatural encounters in the building's constantly shifting facade. Inside, they discovered a chamber lined with mirrors that reflected not their faces, but their true nature. The Holloways appeared as beings of living coal, their eyes burning with subterranean fire. The Carvers had become creatures of wood and shadow, their limbs extending into root systems that connected to vast underground networks. The Lowells manifested as figures of light and pain, their bodies translucent with the accumulated suffering of thousands. The Thorntons were revealed as entities of breath and darkness, their forms shifting between solid matter and something that existed primarily in the spaces between atoms. The Whitakers appeared as living music, their bodies composed of visible sound waves that created harmonies with every movement. In the center of this hall of mirrors sat a figure that seemed to be constructed from the same material as the building itself, constantly shifting between forms while maintaining an unmistakably human silhouette. When it spoke, each family heard the voice in their own way, the Holloways hearing the rumble of deep earth, the Carvers the whisper of wind through leaves, the Lowells the soft murmur of flowing water, the Thorntons the steady rhythm of breathing stone, and the Whitakers a melody that contained every song ever written. "You have served well," the figure said, "but your individual contributions are merely notes in a symphony that has been playing since before your species learned to make fire. The time has come for you to understand your true purpose in the great opening." The entity revealed itself as a direct manifestation of the architect, taking physical form for the first time in centuries. Through visions that bypassed their eyes and spoke directly to their consciousness, it showed them the scope of their influence. Coal from Holloway mines had been shipped across the continent, burning in forges that created the steel for railroad tracks that followed specific geometric patterns. Carver timber had been used in the construction of buildings in major cities, their placement creating a network of resonance points that amplified certain frequencies. Lowell healing had saved the lives of individuals who would go on to hold positions of power in government and industry, their decisions unconsciously influenced by the supernatural debt they carried. Thornton Energy had powered facilities that conducted research into dimensional physics, their scientists unknowingly working to weaken the barriers between realities. Whitaker music had been heard by millions, its otherworldly harmonies gradually conditioning human consciousness to accept sounds and sensations that didn't belong to this world. The revelation was staggering. Every major technological advancement, every significant cultural shift, every political decision of the past century had been influenced by their supernatural gifts. The architect had been using them to prepare humanity for a fundamental transformation, a merging of realities that would allow it to fully inhabit the physical world. But the entity's plans went far beyond simple possession. It intended to create a new form of consciousness, a collective mind that would combine human creativity with its own vast intelligence. The Great Opening would establish a permanent bridge between dimensions, allowing the architect to transform human society into something that existed simultaneously in multiple realities. The families learned that they were not unique. Similar bloodlines existed across the globe, each bound by their own supernatural bargains, each contributing their gifts to the same vast design. The architect had been patient, working through centuries to position its agents in positions of influence, gradually reshaping human civilization to serve its purposes. The coal that burned in the forges of the Industrial Revolution had been mined from supernatural veins. The timber that built the great cities had been cut from trees that grew in soil enriched by otherworldly influences. The music that defined entire generations had been composed by those who heard melodies from beyond the veil of reality. The healing that saved lives during plagues and wars had been powered by forces that existed outside natural law. Humanity's technological advancement hadn't been driven by natural human ingenuity alone. The architect had been guiding the species toward capabilities that would make the Great Opening possible. Radio waves, electricity, internal combustion engines, and eventually computers and the internet, all had been developed with subtle, supernatural influence, creating a global infrastructure that could be adapted to serve as a conduit for interdimensional consciousness. The families realized that their descendants would play crucial roles in the final phase of this plan. The architect showed them visions of the future, of their great-great-grandchildren working in laboratories where the boundaries between science and magic had dissolved completely. They saw Holloway descendants mining materials that existed in quantum superposition, Carver bloodlines harvesting timber from forests that grew in folded space, Lowell healers treating ailments that affected multiple dimensions simultaneously, Thornton Energy companies powering machines that drew electricity from parallel realities, and Whitaker musicians composing symphonies that could be heard across dimensional barriers. The revelation was both terrifying and intoxicating. The families had gained wealth and power, but they had also become instrumental in a plan that would fundamentally alter the nature of human existence. Their supernatural gifts had made them complicit in a scheme that would either elevate humanity to a new level of consciousness or enslave the species to an alien intelligence. As the meeting in the impossible building concluded, each family returned to their territories with a new understanding of their role in the cosmic design. They were no longer simply individuals who had made desperate bargains for survival. They were agents of transformation, carrying within their bloodlines the seeds of humanity's next evolutionary leap. But knowledge brought choices. Some family members embraced their destiny, throwing themselves into the work of preparing for the great opening. Others began to question whether the price of their bargains was too high. A few started to explore ways to break free from the architect's influence, to find a path that would allow them to keep their gifts while avoiding the ultimate transformation. The architect, however, had anticipated such resistance. It had been patient for millennia, and it understood that even rebellion could serve its purposes. Every action, every choice, every attempt at escape only strengthened the web of influence that connected all things. The families had become part of something far greater than themselves, and whether they embraced or fought their destiny, they remained essential components in a plan that would reshape reality itself. The stage was set for the final act of a drama that had been unfolding since the dawn of human consciousness. The great opening approached, and with it, the moment when humanity would discover whether their supernatural benefactors were salvation or damnation made manifest. The family's global network ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. What started as 5 desperate bargains in the Appalachian Mountains had evolved into something far more sinister. By the 1990s, researchers began uncovering evidence that the architect's influence stretched across continents, operating through bloodlines that had been quietly placed in positions of power for over a century. In 1994, a leaked document from a disbanded CIA research division revealed startling connections. The Holloway mining fortune had secretly funded 17 different archaeological expeditions across the globe, each one targeting sites with unusual electromagnetic properties. The Carver timber empire had systematically acquired logging rights to forests containing trees that were hundreds of years older than carbon dating suggested possible. The Lowell Healing Network had established medical research facilities in 12 countries, all studying genetic anomalies that appeared in less than 1% of the population. Most disturbing was the discovery that these facilities weren't just researching the anomalies, they were cultivating them. Children born with unusual abilities were being identified through routine medical screenings and quietly transferred to specialized programs. These weren't kidnappings in the traditional sense. Parents were offered incredible opportunities, full scholarships to prestigious schools, guaranteed careers in influential industries, financial security beyond their wildest dreams. All they had to do was allow their gifted children to spend summers at special camps where their talents could be properly developed. The Thornton Energy conglomerate had become the primary contractor for a project called the Grid Enhancement Initiative. Officially, this was a program to modernize electrical infrastructure across rural America. Unofficially, it was installing a network of transmission towers at precise coordinates that formed geometric patterns visible only from satellite imagery. These patterns weren't random. They corresponded exactly to locations where unexplained phenomena had been reported throughout history. Missing persons cases, unexplained lights, areas where electronic equipment malfunctioned without explanation. The Whitaker musical legacy had produced something even more unsettling. Their compositions, now digitally archived and distributed through streaming services, were being used in what intelligence analysts called auditory conditioning programs. The music appeared in background soundtracks for children's educational videos, in hold music for government phone systems, even in the ambient audio loops played in shopping centers and medical facilities. Exposure was subtle but constant. People who listened to these compositions reported increased compliance with authority figures, reduced questioning of official narratives, and a strange sense of inevitability about global events. By 2003, patterns were emerging that suggested the five families were no longer operating independently. Corporate records showed an intricate web of shell companies, investment funds, and charitable foundations that allowed them to coordinate their activities while maintaining the appearance of separate entities. The Holloway mining interests would discover rare earth deposits in remote locations. The Carver timber operations would clear access roads under the guise of forest management. The Lowell Medical Network would establish research stations to study the health effects of mining on local populations. The Thornton Energy Grid would provide power infrastructure, and the Whitaker Musical Archives would supply the audio components for community outreach programs designed to ease local resistance to these developments. What they were building wasn't just a business empire, it was a delivery system. Intelligence analysts who studied the family's operations noticed that their activities intensified around specific dates, not holidays or fiscal quarters, but astronomical events, solar eclipses, planetary alignments, the appearance of certain constellations. During these periods, the electromagnetic signatures detected around their facilities would spike dramatically. Satellite imagery showed unusual cloud formations appearing above their properties. Wildlife in surrounding areas would exhibit strange behaviors, with entire species temporarily abandoning their normal habitats. The most telling evidence came from monitoring stations that had been secretly established near family properties in the 1980s. These stations recorded not just electromagnetic anomalies, but audio frequencies that weren't quite sound. The recordings resembled the Whitaker compositions, but contained elements that human ears couldn't process. When these frequencies were analyzed using specialized equipment, they revealed mathematical patterns that corresponded to the geometric arrangements of the Thornton Energy Grid. The families weren't just preparing for the great opening, they were actively triggering it. In 2008, a coalition of researchers, intelligence operatives, and concerned citizens formed what they called the Threshold Initiative. Their goal was to map the full extent of the family's network and develop countermeasures before the dimensional merger reached a point of no return. What they discovered was that resistance might already be too late. The families had been systematically infiltrating key institutions for decades: the Federal Reserve, the Department of Energy, the National Science Foundation, the Centers for Disease Control. Not through dramatic takeovers or conspiracy theories, but through patient placement of their descendants and associates in positions where they could influence policy and funding decisions. A Holloway descendant who approved mining permits, a Carver associate who determined Forest Service budgets, a Lowell protege who directed medical research priorities, a Thornton affiliate who designed infrastructure projects, a Whitaker student who curated cultural programming. The Threshold Initiative's investigations revealed that what appeared to be normal governmental and corporate decisions were actually components of a larger pattern: environmental policies that opened previously protected lands to development, energy regulations that mandated specific technologies, medical protocols that required certain genetic screenings, cultural programs that promoted particular types of artistic expression. Each decision seemed reasonable in isolation, but together they formed a coordinated effort to reshape society according to the architect's requirements. By 2012, the families had achieved something unprecedented in human history. They had created a civilization that was actively cooperating in its own transformation. The general population wasn't being forced to accept the changes, they were being conditioned to desire them. The Holloway mining operations provided the rare earth elements essential for modern electronics. The Carver timber products were used in construction materials that made buildings more energy efficient. The Lowell medical advances extended lifespans and reduced suffering. The Thornton energy systems provided clean, affordable power. The Whitaker cultural programs offered entertainment and emotional satisfaction. Each family's contribution made life better in measurable ways. The cost was invisible. People were becoming dependent on systems that were gradually altering their fundamental nature. The electronic devices required rare earth elements that carried trace amounts of substances that accumulated in human tissue. The construction materials released compounds that affected neurological development. The medical treatments included genetic modifications that were passed to future generations. The energy systems generated frequencies that influenced brainwave patterns. The cultural programming shaped psychological responses to authority and change. The Threshold Initiative's final report, classified and buried within hours of its completion, concluded that the transformation was irreversible. The families had spent over a century integrating their influence so thoroughly into human civilization that removing it would cause societal collapse. The infrastructure, the economy, the technology, even the cultural norms that defined modern life were all dependent on systems controlled by the 5 bloodlines. More disturbing was the realization that the families themselves might no longer be entirely human. Medical examinations of family members, conducted through covert means, revealed genetic modifications that appeared to be accelerating with each generation. Their DNA contained sequences that didn't match any known terrestrial organisms. Their brain structures showed enlarged regions associated with extrasensory perception. Their blood chemistry included elements that weren't found in the standard periodic table. The families weren't just serving the architect, they were becoming extensions of it, living bridges between dimensions, hybrid beings capable of existing in the reality that would emerge after the Great Opening. The final phase of their plan was already in motion. The electromagnetic grid established by the Thornton Energy Network was nearing completion. The genetic modifications distributed through the Lowell medical system had reached a critical mass in the population. The psychological conditioning delivered through the Whitaker cultural programs had achieved the desired level of compliance. The rare earth elements extracted through the Holloway mining operations had been integrated into every aspect of modern technology. The biological agents cultivated through the Carver timber harvesting had been released into the atmosphere through construction materials and paper products. Humanity wasn't just being prepared for the Great Opening, it was being transformed into something that could survive it. The question was whether what emerged would still be recognizably human or something else entirely. something that served the architect's purposes in ways that the original 5 families could never have imagined when they first ventured into those shadowed hollows over a century ago. The mountain mists that had concealed their early bargains now shrouded the entire world, and in that mist, ancient hungers were finally approaching satisfaction. Now, as we reach the final pieces of this centuries-old puzzle, we must confront a terrifying truth. The families were never separate entities. They were instruments in a grand symphony orchestrated by something far more ancient and calculating than any human bloodline could contain. The architect's influence has metastasized beyond those original 5 families into a vast network that spans generations, corporations, and institutions. What began as desperate bargains in isolated hollows has evolved into a systematic conditioning of human consciousness itself. Every technological advancement these families have touched, every cultural shift they've influenced, every geographical expansion they've orchestrated has been methodically designed to prepare humanity for the Great Opening. The coal from Holloway mines didn't just burn hotter and longer than ordinary fuel. Chemical analysis of samples recovered from abandoned mining sites reveals molecular structures that shouldn't exist in natural carbon compounds. The coal contains trace elements that, when burned, release particulates that remain airborne for decades. These microscopic particles have been detected in atmospheric samples across North America, creating what researchers now call a geochemical web. Every breath taken in regions where Holloway coal was burned carries these foreign elements into human bloodstreams, gradually altering brain chemistry in ways that make individuals more susceptible to external mental influence. The Carver timber empire operated with similar precision. Their lumber wasn't just unusually durable or aesthetically pleasing. Acoustic analysis of buildings constructed with Carver wood reveals that the timber retains harmonic properties that create subsonic resonances. These frequencies, imperceptible to conscious awareness, influence human neural patterns in ways that promote group thinking and reduce individual resistance to suggestion. Entire cities built with Carver materials have become unwitting amplifiers for psychological conditioning, their very structures serving as massive instruments of mental manipulation. The Lowell healing legacy represents perhaps the most insidious aspect of the conspiracy. Their medical practices weren't just effective, they were transformative. Patients treated by Lowell healers underwent subtle genetic modifications that were passed to their offspring. These changes, initially appearing as enhanced immune systems or improved healing rates, actually represent systematic alterations to human DNA. The modifications create what geneticists term receptor sites, areas in the human genome that remain dormant until activated by specific external stimuli. The architect has been preparing human biology itself for eventual integration with its consciousness. The Thornton musical dynasty operated on frequencies that transcended mere entertainment. Their compositions contained mathematical progressions that mirror the harmonic structures found in quantum mechanics. These musical patterns, when heard by audiences, create permanent neural pathways that function as channels for external mental influence. The addiction that listeners experienced wasn't psychological but physiological. Their brains literally rewiring themselves to crave the specific frequencies that make them more receptive to the architect's control. The Whitaker Energy projects have been the most transparent in their ultimate purpose. Their renewable energy systems don't just produce electricity, they generate specific electromagnetic fields that interact with the modified neural pathways created by the other family's work. The result is a population that has been chemically, genetically, acoustically, and electromagnetically prepared for consciousness merger. Recent discoveries have revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. Archaeological surveys conducted in areas where the families operated have uncovered geometric patterns carved into bedrock, formations that predate European settlement by millennia. These patterns form a vast network that extends across the entire North American continent, with the Appalachian region serving as a central hub. The families didn't choose their locations randomly. They were drawn to areas where these ancient preparations already existed. The resistance movements that have emerged over the decades represent humanity's last hope for independence. These groups, operating under names like the Severed Chain, the Clear Signal, and the Unbound Collective, have developed techniques for detecting and neutralizing the various forms of conditioning. Their research has revealed that the modifications can be reversed, but only through specific processes that must be undertaken before the Great Opening reaches completion. The timeline is accelerating. Corporate records show that all 5 family enterprises have been converging their operations toward a single date. Energy grids are being synchronized, communication networks are being unified, and atmospheric conditions are being manipulated to create optimal circumstances for dimensional merger. The architect has been patient, but its patience is nearing an end. Those who have glimpsed the entity's true nature describe it not as malevolent, but as utterly alien. It doesn't seek to destroy humanity, but to absorb it, to add human consciousness to its vast collection of assimilated species. The Great Opening isn't an invasion, but a harvesting, the culmination of centuries of careful preparation designed to make humanity welcome its own transformation. The signs of the approaching culmination are everywhere for those who know how to look. Weather patterns have been shifting in ways that correspond to the geometric patterns carved in bedrock. Animal behavior has been changing, with species exhibiting coordinated movements that mirror the mathematical progressions found in Thornton music. Most disturbing of all, birth rates in areas heavily influenced by the family's work have begun producing children with unusual neural development, offspring whose brain structures appear optimized for non-human consciousness integration. The few scientists who have attempted to study these phenomena have encountered systematic obstruction. Research funding disappears, data becomes corrupted, and investigators find themselves reassigned to unrelated projects. The conspiracy has grown beyond the original families to encompass elements within government agencies, academic institutions, and international organizations. The architect's influence has become so pervasive that questioning its agenda has become nearly impossible within established systems. Yet resistance continues to emerge from unexpected sources. Indigenous communities, whose ancestors once sealed the original pathways, have begun sharing traditional knowledge about containing otherworldly influences. Religious groups from various faiths have recognized the spiritual dimensions of the threat and are developing collective practices for maintaining mental independence. Even within the infiltrated institutions, individuals have begun awakening to the reality of their situation and working to sabotage the conspiracy from within. The final phase of the Great Opening will require humanity to choose its own fate. The conditioning has been extensive, but not complete. Human consciousness retains enough independence to resist if it can be awakened to the true nature of the choice being offered. The architect's greatest vulnerability is its need for voluntary acceptance, its requirement that humanity willingly surrender its individual consciousness for the promise of collective transcendence. The mountain hollows where it all began still hold the keys to humanity's future. The original bargains made by 5 desperate families created pathways that can potentially be closed, but only if enough people understand what is truly at stake. The mist that shrouds those ancient peaks isn't just weather, but a boundary between realities, a threshold that humanity must choose whether to cross or defend. The next part of our investigation will examine the final preparations for the Great Opening and the last opportunities for human resistance. The time for passive observation has ended. The choice that will determine humanity's future is rapidly approaching, and ignorance is no longer an option for survival. As we piece together the fragments of evidence scattered across 5 generations, a chilling pattern emerges. The architect's influence hasn't remained confined to the original 5 families. Like spores carried on mountain winds, the entity's reach has spread through bloodlines, contaminating new generations with abilities that serve its ultimate purpose. Recent investigations have uncovered children born with eyes that reflect light like mirrors, their pupils dilating in rhythmic patterns that match seismic activity deep within the mountains. These children, found in communities hundreds of miles from the original bargaining sites, demonstrate an uncanny ability to predict geological events and speak in languages that linguists cannot identify. More disturbing still, they seem to age differently. A child born in 2010 might possess the physical development of a teenager while retaining memories that stretch back decades before their birth. The technological anomalies have intensified as well. Smartphones and GPS devices malfunction in expanding zones throughout Appalachia, their screens displaying symbols that match those found carved into the walls of abandoned mine shafts. Internet connectivity in these areas experiences strange fluctuations, with data streams occasionally containing fragments of information that appear to originate from geological sensors buried miles beneath the Earth's surface. Scientists studying these phenomena have made an unsettling discovery. The electromagnetic signatures detected in affected areas don't match any known terrestrial patterns. Instead, they pulse in complex rhythms that seem to be accelerating, as though counting down to some predetermined event. Seismologists report that the mountain ranges themselves are exhibiting unusual behavior, with microtremors occurring in patterns too regular to be natural. The corporate networks tied to the original families have grown into a web of influence that touches nearly every aspect of modern life. Energy companies, pharmaceutical corporations, technology firms, and media conglomerates all trace their ownership through Byzantine structures that ultimately lead back to trusts established by the descendants of those first 5 families. Their products, from the coal that powers our cities to the medications that heal our bodies, carry traces of the same unusual properties that first manifested in the 1880s. Most troubling of all are the reports from individuals who've attempted to expose these connections. Researchers who dig too deep into the family histories find their funding mysteriously withdrawn. Journalists investigating the corporate networks suffer equipment failures and lose crucial data. Government officials who ask uncomfortable questions about the geological surveys are reassigned to distant posts. It's as though the very act of approaching the truth triggers protective mechanisms that have been woven into the fabric of our institutions. The resistance movements that have emerged operate in the shadows, communicating through coded messages and meeting in locations that seem to exist outside normal electromagnetic fields. They speak of a coming convergence, a moment when the architect's centuries of preparation will culminate in an event that will fundamentally alter human consciousness. Some believe this transformation can be prevented. Others argue that it's already too late, that the entity's influence has become so deeply embedded in our systems that resistance is futile. Yet even as the evidence mounts, questions remain. Are we witnessing the final stages of an ancient plan, or merely the latest chapter in a cycle that has repeated throughout human history? The archaeological evidence suggests that similar bargains may have been struck in other mountain ranges across the globe with indigenous peoples who understood the true nature of what dwelt beneath the stone. What we do know is this: the original 5 families didn't simply trade their humanity for prosperity. They became conduits for something far older and more patient than human ambition. The architect they encountered in those mountain depths wasn't offering gifts, but recruiting agents for a transformation that would span generations. Each mine shaft, each healing touch, each perfectly pitched song, each business decision guided by supernatural insight has been a step in a process designed to prepare our species for integration into something vast and alien. The mountains of Appalachia stand as silent witnesses to this unfolding drama. In their ancient shadows, where mist clings to hidden valleys and strange lights dance across ridgelines, the final preparations continue. The bargains struck in 1887 are approaching their ultimate fulfillment, and the choice facing humanity is no longer whether to resist or accept the architect's influence. The choice is whether we will retain any vestige of individual consciousness when the great opening finally begins. Deep beneath the earth, in chambers carved from stone older than human civilization, something vast and patient continues its work. The 5 families were merely the beginning. The true harvest is yet to come.